If you poll a group of average football fans on who they think the greatest pass rusher in NFL history is, you'll likely get a few standard responses. Reggie White, Lawrence Taylor, Bruce Smith, Derek Thomas. You'll probably even get some new era guys like J.J. Watt or Aaron Donald. Unless you poll some fans who actually know their history, you're unlikely to hear someone mention the name David Jones, or as he's more commonly referred to as Deacon Jones, which is a shame because he absolutely has a legitimate case to hold that title. Wait, you mean the same Deacon Jones who officially has 0 career sacks to his name? Yes I do, although I prefer to refer to him as the man who coined the term sack himself. You see, quarterback sacks prior to the year 1982 were never officially tracked by the NFL, so sack totals from players like Jones, who was active from 1961 to 1974, were always the stuff of legends. That is, until now, thanks to the guys at Pro Football Reference. After decades of research led by John Turney and Nick Webster, PFR now has a thorough accounting of every quarterback sack dating back to 1960, and we can finally contextualize numbers from players otherwise easily forgotten. This changes so much. For example, Justin Houston ranks 37th on the official sack list with 97.5. But with the 22 extra years of data, he drops all the way down to 59th place. I've spent the past couple of days just getting lost down numerous rabbit holes while perusing the new sack list, learning more about players I was unfortunately unable to watch live, given that I was born in 1996. Growing up as an avid NFL Films fan, I had obviously heard all about Deacon Jones' greatness, but there was never any real way to properly compare him to later legends. I knew he was an incredibly dominant force, but just how next level was he truly?
Sacking the cornerback is just like you devastate a city, or you cream a multitude of people. I mean, it's just like you put all the offensive players in one bag, and I just take a baseball bat and beat on the bag. Okay, we just found a term.
That's how Deacon Jones describes sacking a quarterback, and how he came up with the term. Pretty colorful, huh? So it would be a shame if he wasn't among the best in league history when it comes to taking down passers. Of course, that's totally not the case. Absent on the official all-time sack list, thanks to PFR, Jones now rightfully sits third behind just Bruce Smith and Reggie White with a whopping 173.5 sacks. And sure, Jones played 14 seasons in the NFL, but that doesn't mean he was just a compiler, not by any means. His 0.91 sacks per game is the most in the league since 1960. This is partially because Jones had what is perhaps the greatest peak of any pass rusher ever. From 1964 to 1968, Jones racked up a mind-boggling 100.5 sacks, which is the most in a 5-year span in league history, almost 20 more sacks than the second highest player. And you have to remember, these were 14-game seasons. And this was in an era where teams passed the ball at a much lower rate than they do now. Let's take a deep dive, shall we? In 1968, Jones had one of his 2 career-high 22 sack seasons. Side note, that's insane. That year, Rams opponents only passed the ball 353 times. Now, let's compare that to numbers from some other pass rusher extraordinaires. In Reggie White's career-best 21-sack season in 1987, Eagles opponents threw the ball 561 times in 15 games. And the year before, in Bruce Smith's breakout 15-sack season, Bills opponents chucked 570 balls through the air. Those are the 2 players who had more career sacks than Jones, and you're perfectly welcome to argue them as being greater pass rushers in the end than Deacon Jones. However, you cannot deny that they each saw far more opportunities, along with every other edge defender after Jones' time. But let's go back to Jones' untouchable peak for a second. The man literally had a 6-year stretch where he put up 22, 19, 16, 21.5, 22, and 15 sacks. He led the entire NFL in sacks in 5 of those years, those being 1964, 1965, 1967, 1968, and 1969. He had to settle for merely 3rd place in 1966. The craziest part of this is that nobody else ever led the league in sacks more than just 2 times. That's how next-level dominant Jones was over his peers. Extrapolating these numbers to 16-game seasons, Jones averaged 22 sacks during this 6-year period of time. Think about that for a second. There have only been 7 seasons ever where a player compiled 22 plus sacks, and 2 of those years were from Jones himself. His 22 sacks in 64 and 68 are tied for 3rd best in a single season ever, and his 21.5 sacks in 1967 is tied for 8th best ever. That's right, Jones has 3 of the top 9 sacking seasons ever. He literally takes up a third of the top 9, and no one else appears more than once inside the top 10. Jones' 3 20-plus sack years is the most in league history, and Mark Gastineau and J.J. Watt with 2 each are the only other 2 players with multiple such years. Jones also has the most seasons ever with 15 or more sacks with 6 such seasons, 1 more than Reggie White's 2nd place mark. Breaking things down even further, the Secretary of Defense sits only behind the Minister of Defense in terms of 12 sack seasons with 8. Deacon Jones was always an underdog. He had to constantly deal with racial injustice as a black man growing up in the 40s and 50s in America. He lived in a 4-bedroom house with his family of 10, he developed a tumor in his thigh while in high school, and he had his scholarship at South Carolina State revoked for the unforgivable crime of attending a protest during the Civil Rights Movement. Then, after having to play at the obscure Mississippi Valley State, Jones was only drafted in the 14th round of the NFL Draft, which doesn't even exist anymore. According to Ray Didinger, Jones was only discovered when teams noticed him outrunning the running backs that they were scouting. After earning a starting role, Jones instantly exploded, becoming one of the NFL's greatest and most innovative defensive players ever. Not only did Jones coin the term sack, but he also became so good with his classic head slap pass rush technique that the league had to later outlaw the move. He was one of the most feared players ever with an insane combination of power and speed, so great that he even chased down kick returners on special teams in his prime. And yet, despite all this fame and glory, Jones still continued to fly under the radar after his retirement, falling forgotten to casual, non-historian football fans as the years rolled by. But now, thanks to Pro Football Reference, Jones' greatness can now be properly documented. Even if you never got to watch him play or only caught his abridged highlights on NFL Films, at least now fans can pull up the record books and see Deacon Jones' name right alongside other all-time legends and recognize his greatness. Because make no mistake, Deacon Jones is one of the greatest players in NFL history, regardless of position, and his achievements only look more impressive with the passing of time.